Pray interly. Julian of Norwich's Spirituality of Prayer. We have arrived at what I think of as the pinnacle of English spirituality, and that is the spirituality of Julian of Norwich, whom Thomas Merton considers the greatest English theologian. Thomas Merton says, Julian is without doubt one of the most wonderful of all Christian voices. She gets greater and greater in my eyes as I grow older, and whereas in the old days I used to be crazy about St. John of the Cross, I would not exchange him now for Julian if you gave me the world, and the Indies, and all the Spanish mystics rolled up in one bundle. I think that Julian of Norwich is, with Newman, the greatest English theologian. That is high praise indeed from Thomas Merton, who had a very ambivalent relationship with the Church of England, but certainly had a profound appreciation for the English mystics, especially Julian. There's much to say about Julian, and Joan Newth's introduction covers a good deal. There's a new book by a woman named Veronica Mary Rolfe called Julian's Gospel that I would also recommend. It's about 600 pages long, so I'm certainly not going to require it for this class, but if you want to delve deeper into Julian, I think that would be a good place to go. She spends a large portion of the book describing the 14th century in more detail than Joan Newth does, and even tries to imagine Julian's life before she was an anchoress or anchorite. She imagines her as part of the merchant class, the daughter of a wool merchant, wool being the most popular export of Norwich in the 14th century. In this lecture, I want to focus on one word, and that word is interly. I argue that much of Julian's spirituality can be captured in this one word. And I elaborate on this in my article in the Compass Journal, Compass, a Review of Topical Theology journal, which is included in your readings for this week. But I want to offer this as a lecture as well, because I think this is important in that it repeats an invitation that I offered at the beginning of this course, which is to bring your whole self. Also, I see it as holding together many different strands that we have seen in English spirituality and Celtic spirituality. It holds together both the apophatic and the cataphatic, the fire and the cloud, the spirituality of praying interly holds together both the temperance of Walter Hilton and the wildness of Marjorie Kemp. I see Julian embodying the Via Media, the Anglican Via Media, in a beautiful way, and a Via Media that's not so much about compromise, but that's more about holding together diversity. So let's begin. Pray interly, though the thing it savour not, yet it is profitable enough, though thou feel it not. What I do not mention in my article is that this is something that is said to Julian. Julian does write it, but she does not say it. She explains that this is what has been said to her by Christ. Christ is telling Julian in chapter 41, pray interly, though the thing it savour not, yet is profitable enough, though thou feel it not. Translators Coleridge and Walsh translate this as, pray wholeheartedly, though it seems to you that this has no savour for you, still it is profitable enough, though you may not feel that. Pray wholeheartedly, though you may feel nothing, though you may see nothing, yes, though you think that you could not, for in dryness and in barrenness, in sickness and in weakness, then is your prayer most pleasing to me, though you think it almost tasteless to you. and so is all your living prayer in my sight. This is Jesus speaking to Julian in the 14th Revelation. In college and Welsh, they offer a footnote for the word wholeheartedly and say the word is interly, comma inwardly, of which the other witnesses have made nonsense. So there is dispute, much dispute around this word. Translators fall into primarily two different camps. So interly is what is called a hypoxlegomenon, meaning it only appears once in any of the Middle English texts that we have. We have no other appearance of the word interly. It's appearing only once. That's what hypoxlegomenon means. And the two camps that the translators fall into are the wholeheartedly camp and the inwardly camp. So College and Walsh translate interly as wholeheartedly, while others translate it as inwardly. Now, before we delve into the linguistic and intertextual perspectives on the word interly, I want to begin with a quote from Clifton Walters, who says that for Julian of Norwich, the object of prayer is to be united to our Lord, and therefore prayers should be bold and prayers should be broad. And there is certainly a boldness and a breadth in Julian's prayers. A boldness and breadth that I think is unmatched and unrivaled by any of the English mystics, including Marjorie, and even stands out among other female mystics. And there are many medieval female mystics who were very bold. Julian is not afraid to ask questions in her prayers, not afraid to bring her questions to God. And in the Middle Ages, women were not supposed to question men. They weren't supposed to question their husbands or their priests, let alone God. Whereas Julian of Norwich does question God. And even when she gets a response, she's not satisfied with the response, and so she asks again. That is a boldness that I don't see anywhere else, especially not among medieval mystics. Because she was praying interly. She was obeying Jesus, who said, pray interly. So let's look at this word. First of all, some see the word as wholeheartedly or entirely. And the argument for this is that if Julian wanted to convey the meaning inwardly, she would have written the word inwardly, as she does elsewhere. Also, interly does not appear in the Middle English dictionary, but the word enterly does. And enterly means entirely or completely. So that leads some translators to see interly as enterly. But why use interly instead of enterly? Why wouldn't she just use enterly if that's what she meant? Well, Middle English borrowed from both Latin and French. And in French, the word is entier, which means entire or whole. And in Latin, the word is integrum, meaning entire and whole. So interly is likely a Middle English word of Latin-French origin, combining entier with integrum. So that is a relatively convincing argument for pray interly, meaning pray entirely, pray with your entire self. And that's likely what influenced College and Walsh to land on wholeheartedly as their translation for interly. But now let's look at the other argument, interly as inwardly. The word interly resembles the Middle English word innerly, which means inwardly, strongly, extremely, earnestly, sincerely, all of those meanings. And interly also resembles the Middle English word interiali, which means within the body, internally, within one's mind, secretly, like interiorly. So interly could just be a unique form or combination of innerly and interiali. So the question is, does interly mean entirely, wholeheartedly, or does it mean inwardly? The linguistic perspective is helpful. We see some arguments for both, but we can't arrive at a real conclusion based on linguistic analysis. So let's look at it intertextually. Look at interly intertextually. again, using these two primary camps. So pray interly as pray entirely, pray with the entire self. This makes a lot of sense when we look at the showings, we look at the revelations of divine love. Julian's spirituality of prayer includes many aspects of the entire self. She is invited to pray interly in the midst of dry emotions. Jesus says, you're going to feel dry emotions, you're going to feel nothing, you're going to feel emptiness, you're going to feel barrenness, but pray through that. You're going to feel the exact opposite of what Richard Rolla talks about when he talks about heat, sweetness, and song. But when you pray, when you continue to pray, even when you feel none of that, that is pleasing to me. Pray in the midst of bodily sickness, even extreme bodily sickness, even a fatal illness, as she talks about in chapter 2. A variety of bodily experiences. She sees invitations to reflect on God and pray, even in talking about digestion and excretion. And of course, questioning God, which I am personally fascinated by and encouraged by. As someone with Jewish background, I have a particular appreciation for the Jewish tradition of questioning God and arguing with God and protesting against God, especially regarding the question of suffering. And that is the question that Julian wrestles with. And Gordon Mursell, last name Mursell, has a book called Out of the Deep, Prayer as Protest. And he talks about this tradition within Christianity and has a whole chapter on Julian of Norwich that he titles The Child's Question, Julian of Norwich. That question about suffering. God, there's so much suffering going on. You could have prevented this. You could have prevented sin from entering into reality. Why didn't you? God says, well, sin is necessary, sin is behovely, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And Julian retorts, yeah, but it's not all well. That's not satisfying. And God responds with, yet again, more revelations of his love. She also sees God's presence and invitations to pray in laughter. So she is bringing her entire self, joy, questions, her body, her sickness, her dryness. She is praying interly with her entire self. Not just with her whole heart. Wholeheartedly, I think, is one of the least satisfactory translations, because that just focuses on the heart. She doesn't pray with the whole heart. She prays with the mind and the body as well as the heart. Now, praying in the midst of dry emotions. Julian does not condemn emotions with the same directness as the Cloud author. The Cloud author speaks with a lot of condemnation towards those who claim to experience God in warm fuzzies, basically, the way Richard Rolle does. Richard Rolle's Fire of Love is basically Richard Rolle's warm fuzzies. But she also counterbalances Rolla by emphasizing the presence of God in the midst of dry and barren feelings. And here I want to talk a little bit about the Ankrenvisse, or the Ankrenvisse. We don't know exactly how it's pronounced, but it's basically the guide for anchorites, guide for anchoresses, written in around the 13th century for 3 young anchoresses of noble birth. And when Julian uses the word courteous and fair, basically courteous and fair, to describe Christ, she is invoking the Christ knight motif found in the Ankrenvisse. And if this was a longer course, I would have you read portions of the Ankrenvisse, which is a wonderful text. And if you want to get more into anchoritic spirituality, there's a whole book in the Classics of Western Spirituality series called Anchoritic Spirituality, Ankrenvisse and Associated Works, with a preface by Benedicta Ward. So, let me share this Christ Knight motif with you. It's a parable in which Christ is a rich and powerful and handsome fair knight who falls desperately in love with a lady. However, the lady responds to all of the Christ knight's gifts and tender messages with hard-hearted scorn until finally the Christ knight dies in order to protect her from her enemies. I'll quote from it. Nevertheless, the love of a mighty king, the Christ knight, was turned to her so passionately that by way of courtship he sent his messengers one after another, often many together. He sent her many beautiful presents, provisions to keep her alive, the help of his noble army to hold her castle. She received it all like one who did not care, and was so hard-hearted that he could never come any nearer to her love. What more do you want? He came himself in the end, revealed to her his beautiful face, the most beautiful to look at of all men's. He spoke so sweetly, and such happy words, they could raise the dead to life again. He worked many miracles, and performed many acts of power before her eyes, revealed to her his might, told her of his kingdom, asked to make her queen of all he had. All this was no use. Is this contempt not strange? For she was never worthy to be his handmaiden. But in his graciousness, love had so overcome him that in the end he said, Lady, you are beleaguered, and your enemies are so strong that you can in no way escape from their hands without my help. So that they do not put you to shameful death after your grief, for the love of you I will take this fight upon myself, and rid you of those who seek your death. Yet I know it to be true that I will receive from them my death wound, and I wish it all with my heart to win your heart. Now then, I beseech you, for the love I show you, that you love me at least after this deed, dead, when you would not living. The Christ knight did everything just so. He rid her of all her enemies, and was himself cruelly abused and finally killed. Yet through a miracle he arose from death to life. Would not this same lady be of an evil sort of nature if she did not love him ever after over all things? This king is Jesus, God's Son, who in just this way wooed our souls, which the devil had surrounded. And he, like a noble wooer, after many messengers and many presents, came to prove his love, and showed through chivalry that he was worthy of love, as knights were at one time accustomed to do. Christ is the ultimate symbol of chivalry, the most beautiful, most handsome, and gives himself fully to her, and dies in order to protect her. And the story never describes the lady eventually falling in love with the Christ knight or the king, but simply asks the question, would not this lady have a base nature if she did not love him after this above all things? And so when Julian uses the words courteous and fair, she invokes this Christ knight parable. And with this passage from the Ancron in mind, we can assume that this story, with which Julian was probably very familiar, was implied in her imagery. And although loving and prayerful emotions are upheld in Julian's spirituality of prayer, she also makes room for dryness and barrenness. Even when one lacks love, and even when one lacks the warm fuzzies, the fire of love towards Christ, doesn't feel anything for Christ, the divine knight, the Christ knight, still persists in wooing his beloved. So even when one feels no tenderness, God is still very much present. And merely directing one's attention to the divine knight makes God full glad and merry, as Jesus says to Julian. This is why he says, pray inwardly, though thou feel it not, for in dryness and barrenness, in sickness and in feebleness, then is thy prayer full pleasant to me. Praying inwardly means praying entirely, even if that includes dry and arid emotions, even if that means you have no feeling of love for God whatsoever. That's very different than the cloud author, whose prayer practice is all about shooting up humble impulses of love. Julian says, if you have no love for God, or you're feeling no love for God, pray nonetheless. That will mean the world to me. Pray inwardly. Pray inwardly to encounter God within one's being. The cloud author calls his apophatic contemplative prayer the inward occupation. So the cloud author does use the word inward. And some suggest that maybe Julian is being invited by Christ to this kind of prayer. So does pray inwardly mean pray apophatically? One scholar, Cynthia Mason, argues that Julian is apophatic when she forgets about her desire for bodily sickness. She has these desires for wounds, including sickness, in order to empathize with Christ, and then she forgets about them later on. And so Mason thinks that maybe she is putting her desire for sickness under the cloud of forgetting, and in so doing penetrates the cloud of unknowing in her visions. I am not convinced by this argument at all. An argument that Cynthia Mason makes in an article called The Point of Coincidence Rhetoric and the Apophatic in Julian of Norwich's Showings. The information on that is in footnote 46 of my article. If you want to read that, maybe you will be convinced. I do not see pray inwardly as meaning pray apophatically. However, as we talked about in our discussion of the anonymous author of The Cloud, we saw that in his book of privy counseling that he often used the phrase that he is thy being. God is our being. So in that way, there is an invitation to understand pray inwardly as pray inwardly, meaning encounter Christ within yourself. In chapter 68, Julian talks about the soul as an endless citadel, not too unlike Teresa of Avila's interior mansions. Teresa of Avila, the Spanish mystic who was a mentor to St. John of the Cross, she talked about the mansions of the inner self, the soul, and at the center is God. God is within us. God is the ground of our being. And the Christ night dwells within the soul. So by praying inwardly, one focuses on what the Cloud author calls being. He is thy being, and what Julian calls substance. William Johnston, in his book, The Mysticism of the Cloud of Unknowing, says, see God as your true being and you see your real self. And that's actually very Augustinian. When we go into ourselves, we encounter God. And we're not going into ourselves in an egotistical, selfish, narcissistic, solipsistic way, but looking inside our soul and looking inside our interior life and our capacity for love and connection with something far beyond our sensuality, our sensual reality. So for Julian, this is when substance and sensuality unite, by praying inwardly, by looking inward. Our heart and soul and mind become one with God. So praying inwardly means focusing on the reality of one's existence, meditating on just the fact that we exist and how that connects us with God. One is connected with all things. I'm connected with all of you. I am connected with the birds outside and the trees and the clouds and the Pacific Ocean, because we all exist. All things that exist are one, and that all things share existence, which is God. And this prayer, this inward prayer, oneth the soul to God, as Julian of Norwich says in chapter 43. Between our souls and God, there is no between. Inward prayer for Julian involves dwelling with the divine being and the ground of being, which and who is within. And that soul is the castle where the fair and courteous, handsome Christ knight rules. It's also where Christ as mother dwells, into whose arms we fall. Julian is unique in understanding the Trinity as mother. She's not the first to understand Christ as mother or experience Christ as mother. Actually, St. Anselm compared Christ to a mother in some of his prayers. But she is the first to make the motherhood of Christ and the motherhood of the Trinity central to her theology, which makes many believe that she was indeed a mother. She has such an intimate knowledge of motherhood that it seems unlikely that she never experienced motherhood herself. Veronica Mary Rolfe talks about this quite a bit in her book, Julian's Gospel. Praying intrally is Julian's way of accepting the divine invitation to dwell with the divine who is within. She uses these terms substance and sensuality. The substance is God's being. The sensuality, according to Grace Jansen, is our ordinary physical and psychological life and is sometimes very far from being always with God. Sensuality includes aspects of the entire self, so that pray entirely. Bring all those parts of you that might seem very far from God. Praying intrally means praying with both substance and sensuality, inwardly and entirely. And so by praying inwardly, finding God within, and praying entirely, bringing those parts of us that don't seem close to God at all, God unites our substance and our sensuality. And that's what Julian talks about in chapter 56. So when I look at Julian's theology as a whole, and her short text and especially her long text, it seems to make sense that the word intrally means both entirely and inwardly. All throughout her showings, she is bringing several ideas together into one. She's holding them both together. Holding a variety, holding diversity and unity, which is the Anglican charism. She is embodying the via media. And I see her doing that with the word intrally. And by praying intrally, God helps unite the substance with the sensuality. There's so much more to say. There are so many visions full of meaning, full of deep wisdom from which we can mine all kinds of new insights. I didn't even mention the vision of all of creation in a tiny little ball the size of a hazelnut, that so small that it looks like it will disappear into nothingness. But it persists because God loves it and God made it. And that is a hopeful thought in an age of anxiety. There's the other image that is speaking to me now, this time around, of Christ's open wound on his side when he is pierced on the cross and blood and water come out. Julian reflects on her vision of that open wound and sees it as a fair and delectable place, with room enough for all mankind to be saved and for all to find rest and peace. After reflecting for decades on these visions, she sees a profound hospitality in God, a spaciousness in God that pours and feeds into the ocean of Anglicanism, which upholds a kind of unity in diversity, a big tent approach to differences and to different approaches to God. Some of my favorite aspects of English spirituality and the Anglican tradition come out of Julian of Norwich's obedience to and reflection on Christ's invitation to pray intrally. It's by doing that that she experiences the wideness of God's mercy and encourages us to be wide in our mercy as well. Be wide in our hospitality. I conclude with these 4 images that were made by students a few years ago as their creative response to their reading of all of Showings. I'm not having you read all of Showings, also known as Revelations of Divine Love, but you are reading certain passages, and you can read more if you'd like, but there's enough in Joan Newth, as well as in the article on Pray Intrally, to be inspired to produce a creative response. And this could be anything. Somebody here made a doily and explained why that was significant and how that was her response to Julian's vision of all of creation as a tiny ball size of a hazelnut. And clearly, others saw the vision of the hazelnut like ball as inspiring creativity. Just as a side note, she never actually sees a hazelnut. She sees something the size of a hazelnut. And even more of a side note, in 16th century, at the Globe Theatre, as Shakespeare was performing his plays, hazelnuts were almost equivalent to our modern day popcorn at theaters. People were often eating hazelnuts at the theater. So hazelnuts were quite popular during Julian's day as well. One student actually performed an interpretive dance in front of the class, which was really beautiful. You may do whatever you'd like. You can write a poem, you could write a song, you could record a video, you could draw a picture, a painting, a collage. This is an opportunity for you to be creative in your response to Julian. The only requirement is that you explain how it is connected to Julian's showings and your experience in reading Julian's showings and your experience with her visions. I look forward to seeing your creative responses. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well.